So I'm sure, if this is the CISO track, we're all familiar with who Sun Tzu is, right? He was a military strategist, philosopher, 500 years BC, worked for one of the feudal kings of China. He is famous for a text, which is The Art of War, which I shall come to in a minute. I'm basically doing him a great disservice in the interests of a talk track, which I want to present. What this session is really about are these things, and it's I have somewhat of a unique position in cyber. I've always worked for emerging vendors, and I've always been an analyst for those emerging vendors, and part of that sales engagement is doing a proof of concept. So as an analyst, I've been dropped into over 300 security operations centers over the last 10 years. And I've seen the commonalities, the dissimilarities, the challenges, the issues that they face, and tried to understand over that time exactly what is causing these inefficiencies or these problems in cyber operations. That's also led me to see some trends and some changes that organizations are making. The investments from making bets in terms of detection technologies, and then how cyber resilience is being measured, or how they're trying to show measurement of cyber resilience. So Sun Tzu is famous for the book The Art of War, and in good tradition, we have incorrectly summarized that as Know Your Enemy. And this was a book brought out by the Honeypot Project, where they wanted to gain intelligence about the tools, techniques, and procedures of adversaries. And this is the underlying premise of the art of war and knowing your enemy, right? When you can look across a battlefield and count the elephants, right, you're able to estimate strengths and weaknesses of your adversary, compare that to yourselves, and plan accordingly. But when it's cyber and the enemy is largely hidden, there's a great deal of value placed on intelligence of the adversary because it's rare, right? And it allows you to make changes to your defenses. And so here's some of the examples over the last few years when extremely valuable data has bubbled up about sophisticated threat actors. So on the far left, right, whichever way you're looking at it, is APT-10, which was actually a company called Load Industries, run by a gentleman, Sue Bin, who spent 12 months trying to infiltrate the Boeing network. Right? It was an air-gapped network. They were able to place a piece of malware on the engineer's workstation that were only able to retrieve information about design plans of the C-17 when it was on that network, and then it was removed from the network. They were able to exfiltrate. We know this because his communications back to some of the sellers of or buyers of his data were recorded by a researcher organization. And so we get a bit of insight into their budgets. 1.1 million spent in the first 12 months, budgeting for another 500,000 for the second year. The command and control infrastructure they used, the way that they infiltrated the engineering workstation, extremely valuable information, and you're able to change your security posture on that. The same with Conti, right? Due to the Ukraine conflict and them having basically a partner that was Ukrainian, they came out on the side of Russia. The Ukrainian splinter group then leaked the Conti playbook, right? And all the tools, techniques, and procedures that those guys go through in infecting organizations, became aware that they were in 428 hospitals, right? And so the reason we've gravitated towards threat intelligence driving a SOC operation based on adversary information is largely because we don't often know who the adversaries are. And so it's just natural for us to place value in this environment. And so it's caused bias, right? Everyone is drinking from the IOC fountain, right? It's you've got IP addresses, you've got domain names, you've got file hashes, imports. Doesn't matter. Give me information about the adversary. And so we see this is basically overload now in many, many organizations, that this data becomes stale very quickly. If it's taken out of context, it's inaccurate. And so it's led to a great deal of burden being placed on threat research teams, threat management teams, SOC analysts. And no one is looking at the other side of the coin, which is their own infrastructure, right? Their own process integrities, the way that they do things, how they're configured, how they're managed. And so Sun Tzu actually said, if you know your enemy and yourself, you don't fear 100 battles. And unfortunately, we've condensed that to know your enemy, right? We've forgotten the other side of this coin. Now, certain thought leaders in this space, the SANS Institute, InfoSec resources, have produced an analysis methodology, right, which is based on know your enemy and know yourself, which is the diamond model, which is represented over here. And so what this states is that for any SOC analyst, if you can give them as much data, as much information as possible about each side or each corner of this diamond, you ultimately enable them to make the smartest assessment of that alert or of that event. And as I've said, the majority of enrichment that we give analysts is really only centered on the adversary or the adversary infrastructure or the capabilities of the adversary. And so one of the things we're seeing in threat management, SOC environments, is really building out and rounding out the data that you give the analyst. The other thing that we see very often is that whilst the security event, whilst everyone starts thinking, oh, okay, is it a cyber attack? Very often those events don't manifest as attacks. They land somewhere on this radar, right? Often it's shadow IT, or one of the things we see is IT guys like to install their own favorite flavor of antivirus or some utility, or they don't want to SSH into the router using using PuTTY. They want to use their own particular tool. So many times we see security events that are explainable in some regard here. Legacy Windows file and print sharing, things like local link multicast name resolution, right? Incredibly trivial to exploit, but really common in environments. The other thing that SANS and InfoSec state is that there are different hypotheses for starting a security investigation. And they can be either intelligence-driven, which is sort of a known bad approach, so IOCs, again, domain names, IP addresses. Awareness-driven, so profiling your own environment, knowing what brand of Wi-Fi access points you use, and if a different brand appears, well, that's an awareness profile. That's out of characteristic with the environment. And then finally, analytics-driven, which is largely been spun into sort of AI, machine learning, but it's often a combination of that with other two philosophies sort of rolled in, sort of a macro model. And so here's the trend, here's the change that we're seeing. Right? This is alert hell. This is complete alerting overkill. Right? 20,000 alerts, 4 full-time SOC analysts. Right? And we're seeing now more of a change now to say, look, we might have all of these alerts, but if we go through this filtration process, right, and I don't care about, of those 10,000, 6,000 are on the guest network from Samsung phones, I don't care about those. Let's have some filtration capability. It's more of this rounded investment now where we're giving SOC teams and analysts the ability to apply a playbook from any side of the diamond. The diamond model also allows you to make investments in different areas. So when you think about what you can do from a defensive perspective, right? You've got, known bad and known good, right? So awareness and IOC driven. You've then got east-west, which is lateral movement through the environment, or north-south, so things that are exfiltrating or getting compromised. You've then got the concept of where you do these things in relation to it at being adversarial-based or victim-target-based. And then you've got different business theaters, like the challenge of OT and convergence, because if you think IT is struggling, wait till you see what's going on in the OT space. But there is a drive through governance to converge those theaters from a resilience governance perspective. We've got good old-fashioned IT in the middle, and then we've got IT, IoT, and transformation requirements as well. So you have a very big map to cover. Now what we see, because of the bias towards knowing your enemy, we see basically most of the investment is skewed into known bad, reactive, adversary-based expenditure. Right? And that dominates the past 10 years in sort of SOC operations. So this is one of the big changes that we're seeing. People are now spreading their bets. Right? They're saying, what can we do in various environments with various methods for finding anomalies, outliers, different hypotheses for finding alerts. And so the way that they're making that change is they're driving it with best practice, right? So the other thing that we're seeing, whenever you go into an environment, there's always the expert, right, who knows better than anyone else in the room and dictates the way the organization is going to go, right? We used to have this saying that the most technical person in the room wins, right? And that adage is largely becoming obsolete now because people are referring to best practices, right, frameworks. That's their safe place, right? That's where they're going to now, right? In the event of a breach, because Bob said to buy product X, right, is not going to stand up in a court of law, right? What people are doing now are following risk management frameworks, right, and using that as the basis for their investments and their decision making. There are many. So we've got NIST, largely driven out of America, and we've got the NCSC CAF, right, which is the UK transliteration of the NIS standard, right, which also has different vertical industry, children associated with it. They're all different, and yet they're all very much the same, right? They start with identification, and then there's detection and protection, and then recovery and response. NIST is split into 5 pieces, CAF is split into 4. But these are very much now the foundation for what mature organizations are doing in their cyber investments. You can't read that because it's too far away, right? So there's a theme running through this, which is know, right? So know your framework, know your measurement. It's all kind of Sun Tzu-ish. And so these are, how you measure, how you would demonstrate, if you were breached, your due diligence, right, and your duty of care from a cyber perspective. Right? And so this is from the UK NCSC. Its goal, what it sets out to do, and then some of the requirements: enable the setting of meaningful target security levels and appropriate and proportionate security. And this is taken from the Irish NCFC, where they try to give you what is meaningful as an alert: effective, tailored, compatible, proportionate, considered, verifiable, inclusive. Right? So these are now the stakes in the ground for how you would decide whether an investment in security is worthwhile or not. Right? Can you demonstrate these measurements if you acquire technology Y? There are many frameworks out there. Again, it depends on your vertical industry. It depends if you're critical infrastructure. It depends if you're holding EU citizen data, right? But you're largely, you're going to fall into some framework somewhere at some point. And so the first step in all of the risk management frameworks is identify. And this is the know yourself bit, right? Understand what you've got in your environment. Because the next step after this is demonstrating risk assessment. Now, if you don't know about 40% of the brands of devices in your environment, then your risk assessment is only 60% effective. Right? So being able to pass an audit to say, no, we know exactly what's in our environment, right, is key for then the subsequent sort of waterfall steps that you take in this framework methodology. They all pretty much say the same thing, right? So you start from a fundamental step, which is understanding what your assets are and where they are. I've got this up as a sort of a reminder for me, really. So this is the NIST wheel. And so this is the first step, identify. But then when you've done that, you move through the other steps, right? So this is the detection and prevention phases or protection phases. And this is about the types of detection tools that are in place in organizations. And it goes from sort of, the known bad, the known good, the AI, and the investments that organizations are making. So in this case, this is about an investment organizations have made in anomaly detection, AI-based anomaly detection. And the point I want to make with this is, it goes back to the diamond model, and it goes back to giving the analysts the most relevant information for any particular alert. Right? So there may be alerts where this is the most relevant information. And so you're going to see two tools who are philosophically different, look at exactly the same IP traffic, and present the information completely differently. So this is a set of TCP traffic, which produced an anomaly in AI, which said unusual data transfer, unusual activity, rare connection from server. Right? So if you're only giving your analyst the top of that diamond model, they're now digging in to PCAP data, trying to figure out what's going on with this thing, right? And that is not pleasant, right? And it's like 45 minutes to an hour to try and figure this out. And very often, 9 times out of 10, it's not conclusive what the analyst is going to come up with. If we look at then exactly the same traffic, but this time viewed through a tool which is not focused on detecting anomalies, but in profiling, categorizing the environment, you can say that here's the reason for the anomaly. This is the unusual connection from server. This is the rare connection. You can see that the traffic from this device was very low until this point, November the 1st. But the analyst can then say, okay, I can also say that this spike occurred from an Apple iPhone on the guest network talking to Apple. Right? So it's not better than the other technology. It's just giving the analyst a completely different view of the same thing. Now, as an analyst, I'm going to say, Occam's razor, simplest of competing theories applies. It's an iPhone on the guest network doing an update with Apple. Move on. New alert, please. And so that outlier, that investment in AI, in sort of, automating hunting, becomes even more valuable when you do blend those sides of the diamond together. This is AI at Armis, and it says device 38 has an anomaly score, and it's anomalous 99.68%, right? So it's really anomalous, right? And it's anomalous because it's using different ports, and the ports that it's using are 137 and 53, so NetBIOS and DNS. And it's dissimilar because it's also connecting to a different host, which is on the internet, 70.7.24.6. Right, now, do you care about that? It depends what the device is. Right, if this is a Windows phone, right, not. Right. However, if you're a patient and you're hooked up to a heart monitor, which is what this is from, you do care a lot about it. Right? So again, it's blending the combinations of the diamond together give you really meaningful and actionable, that's a cliche, but very clear data about the alerts that mean something and those that don't. So then that's looking at outliers. If we then look at known bad, I mean, clearly there's, virus total is a foundation, right? So it's like probably the source for all of known bad things. And so you want your analysts to be able to query sources like that. And again, if it's a no-brainer, known bad, fine, you can act. Also known good. This is also very common. And so this organization uses Cisco as their default networking vendor. But someone's also plugged a CommScope and a D-Link device into there as well. So it's probably not cyber attack. It's probably that shadow IT. But every vendor comes at a cost, right? You're inheriting the vulnerabilities from CommScope and D-Link. And if they're not part of your stable, then no one is doing that patch management on these things, right? So they're conduits into your network. And then now that, we're seeing a lot of people say, look, got IT, they can't scale for OT, but we're now charged with managing the OT environment. Like, how do we do it? And the other thing that is very clear is these two environments are very different. Right? If one really great alert in an OT environment is if DNS resolves. Right? That's a great alert in OT. In IT, forget it. Like, it's happening 1 million times a second. And so understanding like the processes, getting the I don't want to say IT, but getting the security teams to talk to the plant managers about what a good alert looks like is very important. So what we're looking at here are all the changes made to process logic controllers in a company, right? And you can see that there isn't really much integrity in the processes. Now, from an IT perspective, from a security perspective, this is overload, right? Because each one of these is some security analyst is going to spend time figuring out whether that PLC change should have occurred or not. So the security teams sit down with the plant managers and they agree a process and they agree when PLC changes will take place, right? And so this was the integrity of this process, right? Cleans it up. There's actually a lot of production improvement in this organization. And from a security point of view, high fidelity, right? There's no abnormalities in terms of when changes to the PLCs occurred. Same with segmentation, zones, conduits, another fundamental premise against all the frameworks. This is a large petroleum manufacturer, and they are massively disciplined in who can talk to what. Again, from an analyst point of view, if some dot appears somewhere else, it's going to stand out, right? And this is from another manufacturing organization with less discipline, right, in terms of who can talk to what, right? Again, heavy lifting from a security perspective. And so that process integrity, that understanding and really getting profiles and awareness of an environment is one of the things that's missing, and that's why we have consistently things like this, right? So this is the Conti breach of HSC, the Health Service Ireland. And you can see that the basic infection happened on the 18th of the 3rd, right? Now, I guarantee you there's no 0 days, right? I guarantee you the security devices alerted on these things. But they're buried. They're buried in so much other noise. It's difficult to see, or you just can't clearly triage or decide which one is more severe than the other. The same thing happened with Target. If you remember the Target breach, it got labeled commodity malware, right? So the analyst, commodity, put that down now. I'm going to look for the interesting stuff, right? And that was the reason why Target happened. You can see then as we move through basically 2 months of lateral movement, reconnaissance. Like there would have been alerts going off left, right, and center. But because they didn't have all four sides of that diamond, finally the malware payload, the encryption payload, was delivered on the 14th of May. Right? Now, this is typical of many of the ransomware attacks that we see. All the signs are there. We have all the information we need. We're getting all of the alerts we need. We're just not seeing it clearly enough. And so to see it clearly, we always say, you've got to find the needle in the haystack. Right? That's what we're hunting for, and vendor X will tell you they find more needles than vendor Y. What you actually need to do is address both ends of the scale, right? Understand the needles, but understand the haystack as well, right? If you can logically group your haystacks, right, into very clear lists, then it should be easy to see when something unusual is happening. Because then that anomaly, that outlier, right, will surface in terms of what risk looks like, right? So here's what we're saying, that people talk about vulnerability management and they largely say, oh, that CV, that you've got blue keep, you've got zero log on, right? Those are our priorities. Actually, it's a combination of sort of an active threat. An active threat means an adversary using an exploit or a configuration setting, so an ancient protocol, or technical debt. So they're using an OS or an application that there's no more patching for, it's out of date, right? And they're using those things to gain access or unauthorized access to critical assets, right? So it's a multi-dimensional view of risk. That sounds terrible. If you do that, right, then the next thing is the metrics of management. The board want to know how well they're doing. How does their payoff in their investment in cyber occurring? Well, you link that back to the framework. You say, look, the framework says, what security risk mitigations do we have in place? What's our process for the discovery of security anomalies? What is our asset inventory baseline? Do we have any new devices in the environment? Right? How is our wireless network segmented? Right? There's all of these. I think in CAF, there's 39 requirements and 183 single sort of things that you have to do. Right? Build your metrics around that. Right? Because that is what they're going to say. When the judge says, why were you breached? You say, well, we did X, Y, and Z. We had 26 of the 39 at maturity level 4. There's no fault. There's no blame. You can show exactly what you did. And then know how to improve, right? So we're coming to the end of this now. So this was a Ponemon survey of SOCs from 2020. And it leads... it's designed to validate what I've just said, basically. And so SOCs commonly report a number of issues, right? The number one issue is a lack of visibility into the attack surface, right? Because SOCs are very often sort of hamstrung that they don't get the sufficient amount of data that they need. They don't get the asset context to be able to make a good decision about what alert is important enough. And this stems from the bottom up, because they've got too many tools, too many false positives, which means you can never have enough people, right? And therefore you can never do timely remediation, right? And so that is the sort of sequence of events from bottom to top. And so if he was alive today, I think he'd say this, right? If you could demonstrate governance to a cybersecurity framework, you don't have to fear any of the threat actors, right? Because you'll be doing the best that your organization can do. So that's it. Thank you very much. And apologies to misrepresenting Sun Tzu.